All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Designing for Engagement using AI to strengthen learning, motivation, and mastery. While we wait for people to funnel into the room, I'm just going to start by doing a little bit of housekeeping. So if I could get a click. So just things for you all to know. The first is we are going to share the recording of this webinar with everybody within 2 days. And in fact, you can see all of our previous webinars at packback.co/webinars. I'll take this out of order. Please feel free to use the chat for any and all discussion and sharing that you want. It's quite open. In fact, if you're comfortable, maybe just start by saying who you are and where you're from at the moment. Unfortunately, Oliver and I won't be able to see the chat while we're talking. So if you do have any questions you want to be addressed, there is a Q&A feature in Slack. You can get it just by in Slack. In Zoom, you can get to it just by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. That way, if there is anything that needs to be answered, we have people in the room who can escalate that to Oliver and myself. And yeah, just to finish up there, we will have Packback team members in the chat monitoring the Q&A and answering questions. Cool. So let's get this show on the road with, well, everyone else is introducing ourselves. We can too. So, hi, my name's Craig Booth. I'm Packback's Chief Technology Officer. And by way of introduction today, I'm just going to say I've been working on and building AI that helps with engagement and mastery for the past 7 or 8 years at this point. And Oliver, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. Hello, everyone. I'm Oliver Short. I'm Packback's Director of Product and Design, based out here in Denver, Colorado. Like Craig, I've spent most of my career in education technology, working through what to build, when to build it, and how to make delightful and engaging experiences for students and faculty. Really happy to be here today and excited to talk about a topic I think is very, very important when we think about the use of educational technology tools in the age of generative AI.
Thanks, Oliver. And just so you all know, also manning the chat is Barbara, who, if you've been to any of the previous webinars in this series, you know well. So feel free to say hi to Barbara. Before we get into the content proper, I always like to try and situate these webinars. And why are we doing them? Why are we doing them now? And I think the biggest part of the reason for that is just that everybody is feeling a lot of pressure at the moment. This is true of instructors who are certainly feeling overwhelmed when every single week brings new tools to your plate and new promises about what they can do. Feeling uncertain about what should I do with AI, what can I do with AI, and where do those two things differ? Feeling pressure from students. You know, students are using AI, whether or not you like it, whether or not you guide them on how to do it right, and sometimes feeling disconnected because sometimes it takes time for professional development to catch up with what's going on in the world. And the same is completely true at the administration level, feeling pressure from faculty, from students, and from accreditors, and juggling tools who claim to have a big impact without sometimes being able to show that they truly do. Worrying about equity concerns and AI. Will AI decrease or increase the size of those gaps? And worrying about the reputation and trust for the entire organization. Like, am I behind with doing things with AI? Or, you know, maybe even worse, am I being irresponsible and adopting too early? And it's not on this slide, but I'll add one more thing. I think students are feeling a similar set of pressures on everything that they're doing. So this webinar was really born out of this pressure. We've been thinking about AI in EdTech for the better part of a decade at this point, this group. And our goal is not to tell you what to think about AI. It's to hopefully begin to give you a foundation for making your own intentional and evidence-based decisions about how to use it. So this is, in the title, in places you'll see this is part 3 of a series of webinars. If you didn't see the first 2, don't worry at all. It stands alone. Each of these stands alone. But it is part of a 5-part series that tells an overarching story. I'm going to summarize part 1 and part 2 very quickly in just a minute. But this is part three where we've really turned the corner from the foundational stuff to how do you design AI experiences that drive engagement and mastery. So I'm now going to summarize part one, part two, and then we're going to get into part three proper. So part one, really, like it is titled What Educators Get Wrong About AI and How to Get It Right, but it's really an introduction to AI. And if there is one thing I really hope that you take away from part one, and if you're interested in this, please go back and rewatch it. It's probably true that most people are in this room because of ChatGPT and the fallout from that. But AI is a much, much bigger thing than that. AI is a lot of different things. It is the chat GPTs of the world. It's also neural networks, something called machine learning, and expert systems. And each of these things have got different trade-offs and different capabilities. And one of the key things is to sort of understand AI at a high level so you know, should I use generative AI here? Should I use an expert system there? So part one will really get you to what are the types of AI and where and when should I use them? And then in part two, we focused in on ethics before going any further. I'm sure most people in here work in organizations that have AI ethics policies, and they can sometimes feel a little bit abstract and disconnected, I think. So here we really tried to root policy and ethics in values. So interacting with AI, I think, really starts with your values. You name what are your personal and your institution's shared values. You translate those into actionable principles, and your policy is essentially just your principles written down. And it turns out, if you look at expert organizations, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, the OECD, and various governments, they've started putting out sets of AI principles, and they're all extremely consistent. They all emphasize fairness, transparency, accountability, privacy, and safety. And that means we can, talk at a high level about what it means to have a good and ethical AI policy in a way that is generally accepted across the world. The final thing to talk about with this particular webinar is a trade-off between complexity and responsibility. Complex AI models, I think everyone at this point has probably heard stories about how biased or hallucinatory they can be. If we're using those in a high-stakes space like education, we inherit a big responsibility. So part two is really about what is that responsibility and how do we act in an ethical way. All right, let's jump into part three. So this webinar is structured into four pieces. We're going to start by talking about engagement. So what is engagement in the education space? And what does the research say about how improving engagement can improve all manner of outcomes? We're then going to move on to talking about mastery. So what does it mean to master something? What does mastery-based learning look like, and how can we elevate our students? In part three, we'll tie these two things together, engagement and mastery, and talk about how can I select tools, or how can I feel good that the tools I'm using are actually going to achieve these good outcomes. And then in part four, we're going to wrap up by centering humans again in all of this, which is the important thing. And I think the role of an educator is only getting bigger and more important, and people are becoming designers of learning ecosystems through their choices with AI in a way that just wasn't possible before. So that's the outline. Let's dive into engagement. And what I want to start by doing is just looking at various research studies to make the case that engagement is actually very, very important. So the next four slides all look pretty much the same. It is a claim that engagement does something. In this case, engagement keeps students enrolled. Then I've got a image from a research paper on the right, and I'll just talk about it a little bit, and hopefully you will come out of this convinced that engagement is important and that fact is backed up by data. So this is from Ku et al., which I believe came out in 2008, and they did one extremely important thing. They looked at the NSSE, the National Survey of Student Engagement, which is something that is administered to college students and measures their self-reported thoughts about how much engagement they're getting or how many educationally purposeful activities they're doing. And they correlated this with a bunch of data from the students' pre-college days. So their SAT scores, for example, financial aid records and the like. And what they found was a very, very strong correlation between being more engaged, doing more educationally purposeful activities, and we'll get into what those are in a minute, and their likelihood of retaining from year 1 to year 2. So there's very good data that the more engaged a student is, the more likely they are to persist year over year. So let's jump to the next slide. Engagement improves academic performance. So engagement interventions are also directly predictive of academic performance. This paper on the right is specifically about economics courses, but there's no reason to believe that this doesn't apply elsewhere. So they had a few hundred students using a questionnaire that measures behavioral, cognitive, and emotional engagement, and testing which dimensions then were predictive of their grades. And what they found was some extremely non-negligible fraction of somebody's GPA, I think 13%, is actually explainable by how engaged they are inside of the classroom. So engagement makes you more likely to stay enrolled. It makes you more likely, it improves your GPA. Let's jump to the next one. It also closes gaps. I think this is an extremely interesting study because it's one of those natural experiments that just sort of arises in the world. I forget the name of the school that did it, but this particular school did these first-year classes that every single student would take. And a part of the way they did that was they just randomly assigned students discussion partners, which is an interesting natural experiment because all of a sudden, you've got students who would maybe never have crossed paths interacting. And what they found was that when they happened to pair a less engaged student with a very engaged student, the less engaged student became 6.3% percentage points more likely to enroll in the following term, which means engagement between highly engaged and unengaged people will actually sort of bring the unengaged people along. So for students who are relatively less likely to be engaged in online discussion, exposure to more active peers increases their probabilities of passing the course and ... enrolling the next year. So let's just do one more of these. Engagement reduces failure. So this is actually from a paper on active teaching. Active teaching is a methodology that you can almost think of as a very engaged way of teaching. And in this study, the authors looked at some courses that were taught in a typical lecture style, and then looked at those same courses taught using active teaching techniques. And on the right here, we have a histogram, 2 of them, in fact. An orange histogram shows for each course what fraction of students failed. And when teaching in lecture style, in the average course, 34, 35-ish% of students would fail. When you teach those same courses and shift them to active learning styles, all of a sudden these failure DFW rates drop by 33 to 55%, from 35 to 22-ish%. So engagement reduces failure rates. And let's just tie all this together on the next slide. So the case I really, really want to make here is engagement isn't a side benefit of things being engaging and fun. It's actually a core driver. It's a causal driver behind all of these things that we all care about, behind a student's ability to complete a course, to retain year over year, that engagement interventions can decrease equity gaps and increase GPA. So before we go any further, you might have noticed that sort of in those 4 papers, engagement was never super well defined. So let's jump to the next slide. And we're going to need a definition of what engagement means. And in various studies, people might say engagement is behavioral, is logging in or clicking, or cognitive, meaning thinking deeply, or emotional, meaning feeling belonging, or social, meaning interacting with peers. These are all types of engagement. So for now, I'm going to just define engagement as the degree to which students are cognitively, emotionally, and behaviorally invested in the learning process. Given that definition, I would just like to ask everyone in this room a question. And that question is, where do you feel that you're currently seeing the window popped up over the question. the strongest student engagement. So just select whichever of those feels right to you in the Zoom polling function, and we will revisit this in just a few slides. So where are you currently seeing the strongest student engagement? And while you're doing that, I'd like to keep going and start talking about what types of engagement actually work, because I listed a lot of things before: behavioral, cognitive, emotional, social, and then there are more: agentic. How much agency do students have? Performance, how are their grades? Technological, how much are they using technology? And there have been big reviews performed on what types of engagement work. And engagement is definitely multifaceted. There are multiple ways to change these numbers. And probably my favorite study on this is by Tinto, I think from 2006, who reviews a lot of different types of engagement intervention and makes recommendations about what works and what doesn't. And that can really begin to tighten our understanding of what's going on in the engagement space. And one of the things he does in this paper is looks at a lot of different engagement interventions that kind of work. And I've got some of those on the next slide. So again, we're going to share these slides out, so don't worry about grabbing the references here if you don't have the time. So you can go look them up later. But things like academic advising and consulting services, they do help. They are definitely important, but they're not a complete solution because they are outside the core learning experience. So there's no way for academic advising to affect day-to-day disengagement. It's the same with remedial classes. They definitely help. They're definitely necessary, but they don't serve to integrate struggling students in a behavioral engagement kind of way into mainstream academic and social life. They're more about repairing problems. And it's the same with deficiency tracking systems. I have an alert that goes off when a student has failed 3 consecutive assignments, let's say. And then you flag them as disengaged, but at that point you're focusing on repair, not something proactive that's happening in the classroom. And ditto one-off learning skills workshops, important stuff. Teach students to time manage, let's say, at the start of a course, but that doesn't change the classroom culture of passive learning that can drive disengagement in the first place. So here are some things that kind of work. Let's dive into what really does work. And here I'm going to be relying on this survey, which, funnily enough, is titled What Works in Student Retention and Success. This was done in the UK and was a large survey-based study, and they found that 3 things work. And I'm going to just cover these very quickly on the next 3 slides, and it's academic, cognitive, and social engagement. So let's jump to the next slide. When I say academic, I mean teaching. And teaching presence, that is the presence of good teachers and good curriculum, creates the foundation. Without that, nothing else works. You need the clear structure and facilitation of teaching. So when teaching present is strong, engagement is scaffolded, and outcomes improve. Let's jump to the next one. Social presence. It is crucial that students who are going to succeed get peer support and friendship. Integration socially underpins a sense of belonging or emotional safety in these worlds, and the ability of a student to engage with course and maybe persist when things get hard. So it is when students feel connected to peers, engagement can actually turn into persistence and equity gains. Let's do the last one, cognitive presence. This is people feeling engaged with the material. So this is engaging with meaningful, relevant curriculum. Things like active learning methods can ignite people's curiosity, and curiosity is really fundamental to people feeling intrinsically motivated to want to do things. So deep cognitive engagement can keep students motivated and reduce attrition. Let's just go forward one more slide. If you have a background in pedagogy, you are likely rolling your eyes a little bit right now and saying, yes, Craig, we know all of this. This is communities of inquiry you just described. And yes, I did. So way back in 2001, when looking at what it takes for successful online educational experiences. Garrison and other co-workers found you need social presence, the ability for participants to identify with the community. You need teaching presence, the design, facilitation, and direction of teaching, and cognitive presence, which is engaging and the ability to construct and confirm meaning. So the key ways in which we can drive engagement are these in the classroom communicative inquiry, social, cognitive, and teaching presence. Let's just do one more slide. And so this is really just a visual of the previous thing. What we care about is cognitive, social, and teaching presence. Let's just hop forward. And it is at the intersection of all three of these things that the most impactful learning experiences can occur. So just to summarize this whole section, I now have one picture on the next slide. And this should summarize all of it. This is actually adapted from that What Works paper that I referenced before, which is the core of it is inside the classroom. The core of driving engagement is inside of the classroom. And what that really means, if you look at the research, is develop communities of inquiry. That's not enough on its own. This is surrounded by institutional relationships, institutional support, all of those things I said a second ago that are not sufficient on their own, but are completely necessary. So if you want a picture of how to engage students in a research-based way, this is it. And here we're just going to drop the engagement thread for 1 second and hand over the mic to Oliver to talk about mastery, and then we'll be tying those two things together, hopefully in an interesting way. So Oliver, over to you.
Thanks, Craig. Really appreciate that introduction. And before we, weave those things together and discuss how AI tools, educational technology tools in general fit into learning, I want us to take a bit of a step back and refresh and anchor ourselves in the foundations of mastery learning. This is not a new concept. It's a concept that's been understood for decades. The students learn best through clear goals and deliberate practice. But I think a recentering around how you can construct instructional design and intentionality into leveraging mastery learning paired with engagement will be a good foundation for discussing the types of tools that can then enable that in your instructional practice. So like Craig, my section is broken down into a couple of different areas. First, we're going to talk about the pedagogical foundations of mastery learning. Then we'll walk through the instructional design and then talk about where AI can support mastery and also where it cannot. Before I start, there's a really interesting analogy that I love from a neuroscientist named Jared Cooney Horvath when asked about AI tools and in facilitating engagement and mastery inside of the classroom in this new age that we all find ourselves in. And his analogy was I can use my car to gain fitness. I can put it into neutral and I can push it down the street. The question then becomes, is anyone actually going to do that? Probably not. They're probably going to get in the driver's seat and turn the car on and drive to their destination. So I think that's a really illustrative analogy because it allows us to think about not the tools and the pedagogy and the design separately, but as sort of this amalgamation of things that you need to get right in order to take advantage of some of the good outcomes that Craig just laid out and some of the foundational pieces that I'm going to talk about in this mastery section. Fundamentally, mastery learning posits as an educational approach that all students can learn important academic content at high levels. This is provided, though, that they receive the necessary time, feedback, and targeted support. So what I'm going to be advocating for is instead of measuring students maybe against one another or against fixed time constraints or deadlines, mastery learning can help elevate students by using explicit criterion reference learning objectives that gives them multiple opportunities and a very clear path on how to reach that element of mastery. Mastery learning tells us that research around students is best centered in these learning outcomes. And when I describe outcomes, what I mean is changes in learner behavior that achieve academic and intellectual growth. Learning outputs, on the other hand, of which generative AI has made very much a commodity at this point, is the end product of an academic task that places less importance on the journey of how a student reached it. So mastery learning in this new age posits that we can center the process of learning around skills that are going to be very important in the 21st century. These are things like creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and communication that can be buoys for the types of engagement that Craig also talked about in his section. When we think about these foundations and how we get there, mastery learning believes that students learn deeply when specific instructional criteria are met through clear goals early, right? When students are presented with clear instructional goals that they're able to anchor to, not just the beginning, but throughout their process, those areas of improvement are elevated earlier in their learning journey. When they have deliberate practice around that, they can focus their efforts more tactically on improving certain skills that are required as a part of their learning journey, but they need to receive frequent and actionable feedback. You'll hear a lot of evangelism from me on the importance of formative assessment, of the importance of allowing students to fail and baking feedback into that process that is timely and relevant to a student's learning objective. When you do this, you create a sense that students can feel safe to revise and reflect on their own work and reattempt based on the feedback that they've received. These four pieces here ultimately allow us to get to a place where we have motivation and agency, where students do feel engaged and have a sense of ownership and desire over their own learning and their outcomes. You, again, from a rolling eyes perspective, Bloom's taxonomy is something that we talk about all of the time, and this audience is likely very familiar with. The reason I have this slide in here is because it provides precision around mastery learning. It gives you specificity around the types of outcomes and the targets that you set. For example, instructional designers and faculty can actually define which level of cognitive work constitutes mastery for a given unit or parts of the unit that they're in. Assessments can be aligned to the appropriate cognitive level, and the correctives and reassessments that faculty provide can target specific cognitive skills. So students may be able to remember at this part of the unit, but maybe we need a couple of weeks or days or other formative checkpoints to get them to the place where they can apply. The leap forward Bloom's taxonomy gives the theory of mastery learning is its precision. Without it, especially in the age of generative AI, mastery can degenerate into vague standards or one size fits all expectations. Bloom's two sigma problem is another example of this, where Bloom found that students that received one-on-one tutoring combined with mastery learning performed two standard deviations better than students in conventional classroom settings. This work tells us that taxonomy defines the guardrails of the level of thinking in formative practice, and Two Sigma and this research reveals what institutional conditions unlock those levels of thinking. Mastery learning can operationalize those conditions with real tactical recommendations for both instructional designers and for faculty. And AI tools, when implemented in a thoughtful and ethical way, can help scale them. Ultimately, all of this is in the service of intrinsic motivation for students, right? There's some research that was done here, and again, this will be linked out in the materials that we send, that highlights that learning environments have to reduce performance pressure and instead build students' confidence that they can improve through effort, through practice, through self-regulation. Mastery Learning's instructional architecture is inherently designed to produce these motivational outcomes. And Bloom's taxonomy reminds us that real mastery learning happens at the upper levels of that pyramid. The Two Sigma research tells us that personalized, timely feedback dramatically improves outcomes at scale. And when you couple that and ultimately reach this stage of highly motivated, intrinsically motivated students, that's where students feel that the work is theirs and they ultimately perform better because they have a higher degree of agency. The approach to mastery learning becomes important and matters because it's highly adaptive across varying levels of engagement across students. No student disengages because they're incapable, right? They disengage because they don't understand the target, they can't see their own progress, or they don't believe the effort that they put in will ultimately pay off in a way that's beneficial to them. If we simply hand students a shiny new AI tool without thoughtful instructional scaffolding, these tools cannot be expected to produce positive learning outcomes at a rate commensurate with the promises that are made by the edtech vendors selling them. Mastery learning reframes the student instructional tasks around how, what, where, and when of student engagement, and not specifically around what tools they use. Student mastery is not necessarily an inherent student trait. It's a desired outcome scaffolded by strong instructional design. When instructors give students structure early, I often like to say clarity is kindness, they reduce cognitive load around the management and the anchoring actions of the academic tasks that they've been given. When instructors signal their presence, even briefly, right, like even in small touch points, student engagement does rise. Research that Craig's referenced and other research papers included in this deck show a very clear trend that small instructor touches dramatically increase student activity and agency. And reflection and allowing those moments of pause and critical thinking among students becomes so critical because students need to understand how they are learning and not just what they produce. This is an example of some signals that instructors and faculty can use when they're implementing instructional design centered around mastery learning with acknowledgement, guidance, and nudges for students that underlie faculty presence that significantly increase engagement and persistence. This can be around things like coaching, but it can also be around things like praising. So students persist when they feel seen and supported. And this sets the stage for understanding what AI can and what it cannot replicate. We need to start with pedagogy and not with technology. Technology has never been the driver of learning. Pedagogy has always been the driver. Tools amplify whatever design they're placed inside, right? A good tool inside a poor assignment can still produce poor outcomes. And when it comes specifically to AI, the distinction becomes even sharper because of the flexibility and adaptability of these tools. AI must support the cognitive work of learning and not replace it. That happens to be the line that we're all walking. So again, just to recap here, AI supports scaffolded early thinking very well and speeds up formative feedback cycles really well. And good ethical AI centered around pedagogy puts intention into explainability and transparency of making a student's learning process visible so that they can have these formative checkpoints as they go along. However, it can also undermine productive struggle. When we are skipping the line on the process, we automatically and organically reduce that sense of ownership and intrinsic motivation that a student may have. And it also should not be a replacement for presence. So teachers and faculty should be intimately aware of the types of tools that students are using, and they should try to, where they can, provide guidance in a way from a best practice perspective that is consistent, recognizable, and repeatable across the courses that they support. Ethical AI tools have to amplify the mastery journey. They can't accelerate students past it. If they do accelerate students past it, ultimately what we end up with is more cognitive offloading, a lack of agency, and a lack of understanding about where they are in their own learning journey and in their growth trajectory. So, like what Craig did before I turn it back over to him to talk about some of the tools, I do want to just also put in a quick poll and see how folks are feeling that the tools that you have access to in your stack right now in your digital environment that you may be doing, how are those meaningfully engaging their students? Do you feel confident that they're engaging your students? We'll talk about the results of this poll a little bit more towards the end. But ultimately, this comes with some self reflection of what you have access to as well, so that you can scaffold and pair the mastery and engagement journeys together in things that are ultimately what we are all here for, which is the beneficial learning outcomes of the students that we support. Greg, I think I'm turning it back over to you to talk about some of those tools and how you can match those to the pedagogy.
Absolutely. And just to keep things nice and confusing, I'm actually going to jump us back to the first survey that everybody did.
Okay.
So just to remind you, the question was, where are you currently seeing the strongest student engagement in your class? And I just got to look at the results of that a few seconds ago, and I think I saw something that surprised me and something that didn't in here. Oh, great, it's popped up, I think, for everybody. The first thing that did not surprise me is that one of the most engaging types of activity in people's classes is discussion or debate. This is pretty definitionally engaging, right? The social aspect of engagement is pretty much powered by the ability of students to discuss and debate. And then I think one thing that surprised me a little in here was the difference between applied or real world tasks and presentations and multimodal, where real world tasks are flagged up as something that is extremely engaging, and creative and multimodal and presentations are flagged up as things that are not super engaging. And I'm sort of thinking out loud a little here. I might be wrong. I would love to hear corrections in the comments, for example, here. But I think a part of this might be down to the effort required to administer this sort of assessment. That administering a presentation, let's say, is extremely time consuming because you need to be there and present with each student for the 10, 15 minutes that it takes. And if you're teaching a big class, that becomes very important. So I think maybe the way I personally interpret this is that there are two factors that go into this answer. The first is how engaging is the activity. The second is what fraction of people actually do that activity. And I think that assigning some manner of real world task is something that people can figure out how to fit into their class, whereas specifically a presentation, for example, is maybe hard to do and time consuming. And that's actually going to play a little into what I talk about next. So let's jump into the next slide. I actually saw a comment coming that I kind of want to stop and read. I'm not going to let myself do that. I'm actually going to close the chat and come back to that when I'm not speaking. And this is something that I really believe that as a tech person, I care about tech surprisingly little. And technology, like Oliver just said, technology is only effective when it is wrapped around pedagogy. I think the same is true with behavioral design. What we're trying to do here is teach humans, and technology is merely a detail in some ways. So what I want to be doing in much of the rest of this section is helping people figure out, let's say you're bombarded by ads for 20 different ed tech tools in a day. How do you know which ones are worthy of consideration and your time? And I think, if I could just get a click, the way I would look at this is to say what we really want to do is drive institutional shifts and positive outcomes for students. And for that to be true, two things need to happen. The first is that you need to operationalize pedagogical best practices. Operationalize, I have no idea if that's a word I invented. I don't hear people say it very often. What I mean by this is Oliver used the example of Bloom's 2 sigma. If you give a student a one-on-one tutor, they're likely to do 2 standard deviations better than the average student. That doesn't scale. It's a pedagogical best practice. You can't do that at scale because it requires a one-on-one tutor for every student. So when I say operationalize, I really mean just like bring these best practices, give you the ability to do them at large scale. And I think there's a separate scale thing in here, which is if something is hard to do or time consuming, people just start to do it. Tools need to net out to saving time for instructors, or they are just not going to get used. So I think the goal of any tool that you bring in is it needs to be operationalizing pedagogical best practices, allowing you to bring the science of learning to more people more easily, and it needs to be saving you time at the same time. So what I'm going to do from here is I have just 6 questions that can sort of serve as a checklist so that next time someone presents some sort of ed tech tool to you, you can just run it through these 6 questions on the checklist. And if it checks all the boxes, you can probably feel reasonably good that this is something that's worth your time and consideration. So let's start with question 1. Does this tool drive consistent, repeated behaviors? It has been shown from an engagement point of view that frequency of participation is strongly correlated with retention. Learning science shows that time on task predicts persistence and mastery. So the implication of that is you want to be finding tools that can create regular feedback loops, nudges, or structures. So a solid question to ask is, does this tool create sustained habits? Don't worry about remembering all of these. We are going to share the deck, and I am going to summarize these all at the end. But question 2 for now. Does this tool scaffold deeper thinking? Active learning, for example, something that is proven to help people think more deeply, increases exam performance by almost half a standard deviation. So it's worth asking, does this platform encourage citation, reflection, metacognition, and elaboration? So ask, how do you push students to explain reasoning, evidence, or to reflect? Let's go to number 3. Does it foster authentic community and belonging? Belonging is one of the strongest predictors of persistence. So, do tools enable real peer interaction rather than one way compliance? So, ask, does this tool help students feel part of the learning community? Let's do the next one. Does it lower friction from instructors? This just goes back to if it makes life harder, it's not going to get used. So just ask, how much time will this save an instructor each week? Let's jump to the next one. Does it align with the science of learning? Like I said before, technology is meaningless in this space without being backed by pedagogy. So if people start talking to you about clicks, logins, and minutes active, that's probably a red flag. And just ask, which evidence-based framework is this platform built on? Let's jump to the last question. And does it make engagement measurable and actionable? If you can't measure or see something, I think it's very worth asking, is it actually working? So does this tool give visibility into engagement signals? Can you identify at-risk students and identify interventions? So just ask, will the data from this tool help us identify at-risk students earlier? So let's just wrap up. So we've got a checklist here. I think we're sharing something around after this webinar that just contains these questions and some descriptions of why they are important. But if someone throws a brand new tool that you've never seen before at you, I think this is a good way of beginning to reason about, is this something that I should even give a second glance to? And with that, we've got technology out of the way. Let's recenter on humans. I'm going to throw the microphone back to Oliver.
Thanks, Craig. Before we jump in there really quick, now that we know and have a list of questions to ask about a checklist, I thought it would be worth revisiting the poll that we talked about on confidence for the EdTech stack that you currently have access to. So I'm going to go ahead and pop those results, or rather Peter is. And a mix across the board, right? Most of which being in the middle, which I think is very, from a bell curve perspective, what we hear here at Packback, what we hear when we talk to faculty and students. There's a lot of folks who are somewhere in between, who are a little bit wary, who are maybe neutral, who feel like they have sort of a handle on things, but maybe not around the edge cases. I would be very, very surprised to see an outsized piece of either unconfident or confident, just based on how prevalent these tools are today and how often that these tools are changing in the way that we think about instructional design for mastery and engagement, which leads me really well into the ending of this webinar, which is why your role as a faculty member matters more than it ever has before. We want to go from an arena where content is readily available at the tip of your fingers from a lot of different AI tools, and take that away from content delivery into curators and coaches on the faculty side. Generative AI has fundamentally altered the economics of information delivery, but it doesn't reduce the importance of the faculty expertise that can contextualize that information. Faculty define quality, they define standards, and they decide what progression towards mastery actually looks like in their instructional practice for their discipline. AI cannot do that in a meaningful or an accountable way all by itself. The hammer is only as good as the carpenter swinging it, right? So, mastery learning and engagement, and some of the vetting that Craig has talked about in his checklist, um, focuses on judgment and feedback rather than repetition in the way that these tools are used. So if you build in those moments of pause to maximize student engagement and agency, ultimately what you're going to walk away with is an ecosystem that feels not only comfortable, but scalable, as that ecosystem in and of itself continues to change. You know, one data point I like to bring up quite a bit is that the capabilities of a lot of generative AI tools double every 7 months as of 2024, beginning of 2025. And these are from companies that have unlimited resources, that are inherently motivated to make everything that they produce more human. And so, where the instructor comes into that is being able to maximize the design and the pedagogy around how those tools are used. And this isn't without precedent, right? Like, we've seen this in the way that media became available in the aughts and in the 2010s, as a part of a vehicle to deliver content to students. Richard Clark wrote a great book here, whose core argument is pretty simple, but it's uncomfortable, that media themselves do not cause learning. They're delivery vehicles. Just like a truck delivering groceries doesn't improve your nutrition, a new medium like an AI tool or watching a video doesn't necessarily improve learning in and of itself in a vacuum. It requires that faculty presence in order to get the students to a higher level of order in understanding and applying their knowledge. AI feels revolutionary because it changes the speed and ease of delivery. But I think Clark would remind us that faster delivery is not always the same as deeper learning. If anything, it increases the risk that students bypass that productive struggle that ultimately can lead to mastery. It's just a new truck. The question for faculty is not whether students have access to it. Trust me, they do. The question is whether the course design that you're proctoring and using is actually ensuring that learning still happens inside of that vehicle. There was a massive open online course that was an example that I want to talk about for this. And Duke's bioelectricity department, over 12,000 students enrolled, and only a few hundred actually completed the course in good standing. The issue wasn't video quality or the platform or anything like that. It was the learning design. When we focus on this delivery alone, we get scale without the persistence. And while access may improve, engagement doesn't. On the right side is a shift that mastery learning pushes us towards, an integrated view of that technology. Technology can change behavior and motivation, but only when it's designed around how students and people actually learn. This is a mistake that we really need to avoid with generative AI. It's an incredibly powerful vehicle, but we use it simply to accelerate. If we use it simply to accelerate content consumption, we'll recreate the same engagement problems that we saw with media at an even faster pace. This is an example from a data point of view of what that course looked like, where you had 100% of students registered at the top, and then a various funnel of how they engage with that open online course as they went through. And the results are pretty striking, where you see only 2.5% ultimately at the end passing that exam. They had access to videos and instructional tools and various lessons and activities that they could do on their own. But ultimately, without that faculty presence, they weren't able to get to the point that led to some of those better learning outcomes. What this looks like in practice is really clear criteria for using not only tools, but the content that students are consuming up front, curating high quality instructional resources instead of recreating explanations that are already explained through the content, and also allowing space for pause and reallocating time from lecture to feedback and revision coaching where appropriate at scale. So that's where AI can provide a really big benefit in what Craig talked about in terms of formative feedback at scale for large enrollment classes. But when done in practice across these three disciplines, ultimately you can get a really large payoff if you go about this thoughtfully. A key component to this is actually teaching students to self-regulate their AI use. What are best practices, not only from the institutional policy that I may have access to as a faculty member, but in my class, where is it okay to use AI and where should you not be using AI? They're great. These tools are great for planning, practice, and feedback. Those are some areas where I would recommend taking a look to start. But students have to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly about using these tools, because mastery ultimately includes judgment and not just the output of what a student delivers. If we're able to build in moments of pause, moments of revision, moments of reflection, we are ultimately able to give students a little bit more agency into their own learning journey. This comes with designing AI for self-regulation as well. Require transparency and explainability and reflection. Be honest with your students about how you're using the AI and how they should be using it, and what you don't understand too, because a lot of these things, as I mentioned, they change every half year or every semester in terms of the capabilities that they offer you as a faculty member and as a student tool for instruction. Embedding checkpoints is a really clear way to help make sure that you reduce the cognitive offloading and require independent thinking, and look through assessing decision making, not just the polish at the end. The reason you need to do this is because there is a lot of research out there on the harms and the accelerative properties that AI can offer. The two studies here talk about how ChatGPT specifically can harm AI in the classroom, but there are also just as many studies about how when AI is used thoughtfully, it can produce real learning gains, right? This is a particular study on how AI tutoring actually outperforms the active learning that Craig was talking about before. Um, on the left, you see from a 2024 study how students began with the same baseline knowledge and then experience either active lecture-based instruction or AI-supported tutoring. And on the right, you see the outcome. The traditional active learning improves scores meaningfully over a baseline knowledge. However, AI supported conditions produce an even larger gain. So this mirrors a lot of what Bloom was talking about when he talks about his two sigma problem. And the image in the bottom left reinforces that in historical context with access to new tools that we haven't necessarily had before and are now trying to adapt into research-based pieces that we can jump in and use with our students at scale. Students actually perform better on practice problems when they're given access to GPT. However, and this is one of the most interesting studies that we'll talk about in this deck, when ChatGPT access is taken away, students in that base group actually perform worse on summative exams at the end of a semester. There's another great study out there called Your Brain on ChatGPT that I would encourage to push people to read that talks about actual measurement of electrical activity in the brain for folks that have no access to the internet as the first control group, a search engine, and then ChatGPT as the variable groups, and how cognitive offloading happens rapidly and in real time when an over reliance without direction happens on some of these tools. You can ultimately build classrooms where engagement leads to mastery, but engagement must produce learning, not just activity. Those multiple low stakes formative checkpoints are a great way to do that. Revision and reassessment need to be a table stakes expectation in the way that these classrooms are run. Like if you're going to use some of these tools to ultimately help your students accelerate towards a level of mastery. And mistakes should be treated as data. Mistakes are not the final product. That productive struggle is useful and it's helpful. And when paired with these tools, we ultimately get to a place where students feel comfortable and have more agency around their own learning journey. And we talked about this earlier, but I do want to underline that psychological safety will enable this type of engagement and mastery. Clear expectations, that is kindness, and reduce anxiety in the way that students are approaching their assignments. Revision will normalize the struggle, and growth is going to ultimately replace the way that we rank today. A mastery aligned AI aware course flow has clear mastery criteria shared up front, curated resources, and optional AI support, various planning checkpoints built in, and opportunities for revision from draft to feedback, whether that be AI feedback or teacher feedback. And then finally, an opportunity for reflection and reassessment. This shift matters for faculty because it allows you to gain leverage, not additional work. When you have more feedback interactions and fewer conversations about did I use AI or did I not, when you go from a black and white space of how AI can be used to an intentional space where it can be integrated, you have fewer accusations that are baked in and more productive conversations about a student's own learning journey. When you do this, you can ultimately lead to much better outcomes at scale by making sure that we understand that ethical AI tools should amplify this mastery journey and it shouldn't accelerate students past it. So when you're in the driver's seat and you're helping make some of these decisions, keep some of those principles in mind and try to find applicable ways to bring that into the way that the students experience not only the technology, but the pedagogy that grounds the technology in their own growth. So those are the only pieces. That's my piece for the end of this. I do think we have some wrap up details that we want to get into before opening up the floor to some additional questions, which I have seen on my side monitor definitely coming up in the chat.
Excellent. Yes, I'll just do some wrap up housekeeping. And to that end, I'm going to close the chat again because I cannot stop myself from reading it. So first of all, just to place us back in sort of the context of where we're at in this entire series. And this is extremely relevant to some of the things that I just saw come in the chat as I had to close it. Part one, what is AI? Part two, ethics and AI. Part three, designing with pedagogy in mind. Then in part four, we're going to start talking about originality, critical thinking, cognitive offload, and the like. In originality starts with us, helping students think for themselves in an AI world. A link to sign up for that will be coming shortly. And actually seeing the questions that are coming in, Barbara, is it okay if I throw the mic to you? Because I think you might be singularly well suited to answer a couple of questions. If Oliver, I could get a single click. Um,
Certainly.
and before we go to the rest of the questions, Barbara, if I could have you weave the invite to the very next webinar that Packback is doing to a couple of the questions that came in, that would be
Absolutely.
great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Craig. Yeah, so we saw a few questions come in regarding like AI detection and seeing high AI risk and, understanding those detection systems. They have their flaws. They are not perfect. But also it being really discouraging when you're seeing a lot of those high risks come in. And then also questions about what do we do when we have asynchronous online courses and you're not meeting with your students regularly. And this next webinar that we're having is reclaiming engagement and talking a little bit about some of the work we're doing on our platform, but really about how we move from this detection fear-based reaction to AI and recenter on some of the things that we always know matter in learning. And that's self-regulated learning. It is making sure students are engaged in their learning process, they see value in it, and bringing that process to light. So allowing opportunities for students to annotate their own thinking, to think about their own thinking, to know that there's value in how they come to a conclusion, not just the conclusion or the product that they submit at the end. And allowing that to be like an open dialogue between students and teachers, right? Making it visible so students can learn. And then also making it visible so teachers have a bigger window into how students are engaging with content so they can identify at risk, they can encourage that positive behaviors in students and have confidence in authorship, of course. So we'll be talking a lot about engagement and what is coming on our platform and engagement insights in this next webinar in January.
Excellent. I'm just editing the slides very quickly. There we go. I just deleted the QR code. Please use the link in the chat if you want to sign up. Sorry about that. So we're now going into Q&A. Barbara, I know you're sitting on quite a few questions. We only have 3 minutes left if you just want to pick one of them to throw to either Oliver or myself.
Absolutely. I think there's a great one for you, Craig. Going back to that definition of engagement and thinking of it, we often think of it as a feeling, but it's also an outcome of decisions and design. So someone was curious, what is a decision that you have made in product and technical decisions that was specifically for engagement?
Ooh, that's okay. So to tie this back to the webinar and also chatting with Kevin Morrow in the chat while Oliver was speaking. I think a few things sort of come together pretty quickly here. I like to think of designing for engagement like the National Survey for Student Engagement. Specifically, that is a survey that lets students self-report not any outcomes, but whether the conditions for learning are being met is essentially what that boils down to. And I just saw a new QR code go in, so everyone feel free to scan the QR code if you would like to now. But anyway, engagement in AI tools is the same. Our job is to build a system where the conditions for learning are met. And there are a few sort of principles that I always bear in mind here. And one of them I did get to say in the chat already, which is productive friction always beats frictionless completion. That it is not necessarily bad to make people do the work and to make them struggle and to make them reflect. But on top of that, a big part of it is like transparency. If you're feeding things into a black box and getting answers back, it's very easy to become disengaged. Transparency disincentivizes disengagement. I also think you need to build AI that surfaces thinking, doesn't replace it. I'm sure at this point, everyone who has interacted with ChatGPT, at least I have had this like awful moment where you realize you've started to default to asking the AI to do things rather than spinning up your own thinking. And I think that's the danger of the black box here, that it's just easier. If I need to undertake a small piece of research, I'll frequently just ask ChatGPT to do it for me. And that makes me profoundly uncomfortable. In a learning environment, we really need to work on AIs that surface, not replace thinking. that help you think and don't think for you. So just to summarize, engagement actually, I think, is a design outcome. We are building a system that puts in place the conditions for learning to happen. And a few of the ways we do that: productive friction beats out frictionless completion every time. Surface thinking, don't replace it. Be as transparent as you can, because that disincentivizes disengagement. And with that, we hit one. Let me see. Great. I did see at the bottom of the chat, can you enable the saving of the chat, or at least copying of the chat? I just got confirmation in Slack that we can share a chat log recap, slightly sanitized to remove PII and the like. But yes, we are able to share that out. So everybody, thank you so much for taking the time with us today. Honestly, like an hour out of the middle of your days is big. I really appreciate all of the interaction that happened in the chat today. This is why I do what I do. I love just getting to have these interactions, and thank you. I am grateful to each and every one of you.
Likewise, it was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being engaged in the chat and asking really thoughtful questions. We hope to see you at the next webinar.